Great to have you, Scott. Real quick, if we could just do like a quick intro for those who might not know you of who you are, what is Gitcoin, and sort of like what you're working on right now would be awesome.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Scott. My role at Gitcoin is being sort of flexible over the last few years. I'm a co-founder along with sort of like Kevin, Debate, the others, and we. I guess I started doing like partnerships, like for the most part, and that sort of transition to trying to keep us alive in the bear market by getting people on board to like hackathons and like these other deals, and then eventually with this sort of plan to launch the DAO, I've shifted more towards like a community role, and that's being like sort of just stepping back and like helping make sure that stewards and other folks like kind of have a process in place, understand roughly where things are going, and that's been really fun. I've honestly like enjoyed that a lot more than the bear market like sales driven stuff, because that was just like felt like traditional company in some ways, and now we feel a lot more, I think, like open and like engaged with, we're not like, we don't have to be like thinking as much about like, okay, how can we sell enough things such that we can run grants rounds so that we can like do the thing that we actually want to do. We can actually just straight up focus on grants rounds and public goods funding like as the very first principle, which is nice. So that's kind of like, yeah, my background before that, just to reference, I've been in the space for a few years, since like late 2015 or early 2016, working on this thing originally called Venture Equity Exchange, which was like, how can you create founder like cooperatives, like sharing equity between like a group of founders. And the DAO hack happened, no one wanted to do DAOs for a while, so I kind of like gave up on that idea for a bit. And then it wasn't until like maybe late 2017 that I started working. I was working on a similar idea to kind of what SourceCred is doing now, which was just an extension of like, okay, how can we like determine the reward values that people will get for like participating in these like collectives or these like kind of decentralized organizations. And then Kevin was working on Gitcoin at the time, and I was just like, oh, this is like a much simpler way to start to like iterate with like the bounty model and like kind of getting people engaged from the very beginning. And that's sort of how I ended up in that position. So anyway, that's a long probably explanation, but yeah. For those that don't know, Gitcoin now is like principally focused on like, its mission has always been growing open source software. And to start, obviously, bounties, we're doing that for contributors, first and foremost. And now we've also really started to focus in on grants being kind of a mechanism for people who have like graduated to a level where they have a project they're working, they have an idea that they want to keep promoting and putting out into the world, to like actually build that and get funding for it. Especially things that are infrastructure focused that like might otherwise like not be funded. So things like Wallet Connect, JS, things like Uniswap and your grants, and they have like a clear path forward for like monetization. But yeah, that's probably the most succinct explanation I can get.
Awesome, appreciate that. Yeah, it's interesting to see the change in your work and honestly the thread of similarities between what you were working on with the like figuring out how to distribute equity between founders versus the current problem now. I remember a professor of mine was one of the leads on this project called Slicing Pie, which was like fair startup equity calculator. And it was really just this complex spreadsheet. So it's awesome to see how crypto and like different projects in the space have allowed that to evolve. I'm curious, I think like there are a bunch of questions that I have that are a little bit more specific, but I think a great way to just open up this conversation would just be if you can give your definition of what are public goods, and kind of give us the rundown of how you think crypto fits into like that definition and vision.
Yeah, the slicing pie stuff is super interesting, by the way. Like that's, I was a huge fan of those, the writing on that stuff, even before I got into crypto. And like, that was part of like my thinking around like that wasn't like specifically the influence, but it was like one of the things that like made me really interested in the idea of like sharing equity between founders and that early exploration in the space. But yeah, the overall like what is public goods is like a big question. It's like a very hard question to answer because like everyone has different definitions. Actually, Toby from Other Internet and some others are doing really good writing on this. I tried to do like a bit of a mirror post where I like talk a bit about like the difference between digital public goods versus like traditional public goods. And I think like the biggest kind of like, so the first question you have to ask is like, what is like a public, like what is a, public space or like a public like concept? And that even has like a lot of like historical baggage, and like it's super interesting actually to look at like how that's evolved over time. There's like obviously like the 17th and 18th century like ideas of a public, but there's also like a lot more like even earlier concepts of that. Like Andy Tudhope talks a lot about like consensus driven versus like voting driven societies, and like a consensus driven society tends to like kind of loosely or informally define the public, whereas like now societies tend to like especially like North American societies tend to be like very explicit about like, oh, this is public and this is private, and those things are very hard to define. It really depends on the system that you're like embedded in. But like in terms of historical press, like public were like things that were, and an economic definition is like things that are like non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So, clean air or like clean water are things that, in theory, you can't really be excluded from. No one can really like take those things directly away from you. Clean air is probably the easiest one because like, if there is, clean air in such a region, like then everyone breathing it doesn't restrict others from breathing it, which is kind of like the non-rivalrous part. And then like there's no section of like the city or like rule that you have to have such that like you're excluded. You just have access to it by default. Other things that people typically call public goods are like roads, bridges, like public infrastructure. But one of the interesting things, like note, is that like public goods don't necessarily always. There's degrees of publicness, right? So like if you don't have a driver's license in like Canada or the US, like you can't really use the roads in the same way, and like that's like a restriction on something that's like technically a public good. And so like digital public goods are this like concept of like Web2 or Web3, like open source software or like tools that are like globally accessible. It's much harder to restrict those versus like things that are geographically bound. And you have the ability to really like really level up like how open and accessible things are. But the trade-off is that you also like have less people interested in funding them. Because like the more accessible something is, like the more you like this like increasing tragedy of the commons or problem. So ultimately, the end goal of defining like we still don't I think have a good definition of public goods, but the ultimate goal of like Web3 public goods versus even like traditional open source software is like, okay, like that problem, that like tragedy of the commons is like very prevalent in traditional open source software. And so, the Web3 solution is, well, we just add this like incentive layer, like the base of like the ecosystem, like E in the case of Ethereum. And like you have the ability to generate a larger kind of like almost self-interested incentive for people to like give back to the public goods. And that has played out like that. I think that's borne out in like how things have worked with Bitcoin. Like I don't think there are other platforms in Web2 that like do open source software, like crowdfunding and like sustainability. And like they haven't really had the same, I mean, they've had some degree of success, but they haven't really had the same level of like contribution. And I think that's partly, especially relative to the ecosystem size, like because open source software in Web2 is like massive. And so I think the problem fundamentally is like in Web3 and Web2, you don't have that like incentive. In Web3, you can tell people like if you start funding EtherJS or Wallet Connect or all these other tools that people use, like Hardhat, another good example, then you can actually improve your own position too. And like you hopefully are like getting this like weird mixture of like, it's like to some extent, like you have this weird mixture of like club goods, like and things that are somewhat restricted, but are generally public, and like full on public goods. And so I guess like you can see it either way, where like the definition of public is expanding, or where like you almost have these like clubs that generate positive externalities in some like kind of interesting fashion. I know it's like a long answer, but like, yeah, public goods is a hard like definition to like pin down. And I think also, you know, everyone has a different like view of what they care about more in like terms of public goods. And like as a DAO, like we're not trying to like enforce a particular view of public goods beyond just like giving the economic definition. So like some people probably would disagree with like the kind of things that we might characterize as public goods. Anyway.
No, that was awesome. I think you said something at the very end just now, along the lines of like in Web3, you could tell people that if you start funding a public good, that will improve their own position. I'd love if you could just dig into that a little bit more, because that was a bit unclear to me.
Yeah, like, I mean, if you rely on Ethereum to run your project, or like people often talk about Ethereum as a city, right? And like, if you don't have roads and bridges in your city and people can't get anywhere, like your city's probably not going to do very well. Like similarly in like a digital context, like if you have a lot of like, you know, if you don't have like any real like infrastructure that's connecting these projects together, or like making these projects more sustainable together, you're probably not going to get like very far either. So like when you fund things like Wallet Connect, you fund things like, and like shout out, there's like a Gitcoin grants round going on right now. So like obviously gonna promote that. But like when you fund these things, you're creating basically just better infrastructure for the entire ecosystem. And like the most obvious example, I think, to people is probably like ETH2 clients. Like ETH2 is like that like North Star a lot of the ecosystem is moving towards. Like we recognize that, like, and like layer 2 stuff as well, like just generally like scaling and optimizations there. Like we all recognize those things are like required. And we recognize that like we will all be better if those things are achieved, which is why like when EIP 1559, like not ET specific, but like things like that get passed and like get put forward, everyone's like, oh, like this is going to have a huge impact on price. Like whether they're right or not, like people are like assuming that like these things will be really relevant to them from even a speculative perspective. And like what that does is like you obviously don't want like too many speculators. You prefer to have participants, but like even though you run into that problem, like I guess the solution that Ethereum posits is like you're always going to have people that are like less engaged and people that are more engaged. So like why don't we give the people who are like less engaged like stuff to do too? Like why don't we make sure that they're like aligned? And so even by like, you know, like by being a speculator, you have a reason to fund ETH2. You have a reason to make sure ETH2 happens because like it's very much in your like best interest. So that's like kind of the difference between like in Web2, there was no such incentive. Like you could free ride forever and like it wouldn't really impact you, except that like maybe at some point like you run into like critical vulnerabilities, but those would happen so rarely that like people would always forget about them. It's kind of like companies never pay like their IT departments until like they really feel like they need to. And so in ETH, like in our world, I guess like in Web3, it's just like much more explicit that like these are things that you'll need to like consider in like being a participant. And you like see it like all the time. Like you face this with like gas, you face this with like all kinds of interactions by default. So I think that is like, that's the key difference really, is that like, you don't have to necessarily believe public goods are good to fund them. Although like, obviously we're trying to like make that case, like ensure people are like participating a lot more actively.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating perspective, because I think the idea that the Web3 space is much more active in funding public goods is like something that's really hard to argue against. But the point you make is that it's much more explicit and almost a requirement that in order to participate in the space, you have to be funding public goods, gas fees being one of the examples there. I'm curious, do you think that decreases participation or decreases like the total amounts of potential people who will get involved in Web3 at some point, given that like higher barrier to entry through participation?
I think it depends. Like, I mean, there's definitely been a lot of argument about this. Like, I know Kayvon wrote a really good post a while back on like, I think it was like Ethereum wants to be seen. Like, I think there's people who can make the argument that like eventually like all the infrastructure we use will like be very obvious to people, and we don't need to like hide it away. It'll just be like part of the process of interacting. Just like, I mean, originally, like the concept of like email or like the concept of like a message board was like confusing for people to figure out. Like, I know a lot of people who are like, I guess older now, like, you know, who grew up with like MySpace or whatever, or like playing Neopets or something, like you learned to code like very basic things from just those experiences. And like learning to code from those experiences was extremely important for them to like get involved, but like wasn't obvious to them. Like it wasn't like something that they already knew how to do. So like I think, and eventually those things became easier. So like there's an argument to be made like that either people will just like start picking up those things, you know, and they'll become like a common part of how we work now. Like I think most people, for example, like understand some degree of like roughly like, okay, what is Markdown? What is HTML? Like, I think most people using the internet, even if they're not coders, like get a rough sense, have a rough sense of like what these things are. But then, you know, I think there will be some probably apps that take the approach of let's just totally abstract away like the crypto part of things so that participation is easier. Like there was all that conversation around like meta transactions a couple of years back and like gas abstraction. And I think that's like still happening. Like I think that's like probably going to be like more prevalent like at some point in like the next cycle. But like I think both approaches are pretty valid. Like and I think both approaches are kind of independent of like the public goods like component of this, right? Like the fact that like public goods are like more incentive aligned in this context, like is independent from like how easy Web3 is to use. All it changes is like the like scale at which you're like collaborating, I guess. Like there's like a difference in like the total, like there's like the subset that is Web3, and then there's like all of open source software. And like the smaller that subset is, like the more problems you're gonna like run into, and like how do you expand this to Web2 and like to the broader open source ecosystem? Like, because there just won't be enough funding to fund things like Babel and other like core infrastructure in Web2 that I'm shouting at Babel because they have a grant now too. But like eventually it'd be nice for Web3 to be able to go back and fund Web2 stuff too. And that can only happen in a certain scale. And that scale can only happen if you have this sort of like increased participation. So like I don't know how that will end up, I guess. But like I think it's worth noting that there's sort of like independent problems that are like both important to address.
Definitely. I kind of want to move this idea. So Gatecoin is obviously a massive player in the space. It's been around for a while as far as like funding public goods. But as DAOs become more popular and as we see like DAO treasuries becoming like larger and larger players in the space, we'll begin to see a lot of the funding of public goods or just the funding of all goods come out of these like community run DAO treasuries. I'm curious, like what will need to ensure that the most important public goods in the space continue to get funded as the actual sources of the funding continue to become more and more decentralized, and like more voices to the table regarding like what is and is not important.
So I actually think the emergence of DAOs helps rather than hurts the like probability of public goods being funded. And like that's part of the reason that we became a DAO in the first place on our side, is to like generate like a way for the community to be involved in those discussions and to kind of set parameters for themselves around what counts as public goods and like what should be funded. I think that like going back to the, you know, DAOs as like clubs example, which I think is, or like text, which I think is like kind of true right now. I think like most DAOs like are like this weird mixture of like either like public goods with like limited scope, or like club goods that produce positive externalities. Like there's like some like one or the other. But like in either case, a you end up with a group of like entities that can, I think, more actively like they're just like more. They are naturally tied to the infrastructure they're using, so they're more embedded in the ecosystem. They are more like active, therefore, in the ecosystem, and therefore, like they also see the problems more readily that are in front of them, because those problems like will block them from doing things they need to do. So, I think you're going to see DAOs like maybe Uniswap as a protocol is a good example. Like I'm sure Uniswap would really want to fund its own ecosystem infrastructure more than it would want to fund like general public goods. But in theory, those things can like work in tandem. So like one of the ideas that we have in terms of like the stewards have been talking about this a little bit in the forums is like, what if there was like, a grants fee that like went back to the general public goods treasury that was used to fund general public goods, even if DAOs are funding public goods or like club goods or whatever you want to call them, that specifically benefit their ecosystem. So like Uniswap building stuff for Uniswap, Compound building stuff for Compound, and basically some like fraction of that being taken back and given to a general pool that goes back to fund the overall infrastructure. And I don't think anyone would object to that, because they also need those things to be done, even if they want like their own goods to be funded like selfishly more than anything else. So I guess like that's one way to look at it. DAOs probably will start to one thing that's we've been dealing with like the Kita situation and like all this treasury management stuff is like how we interact with other organizations more flexibly and consistently. Like we need to figure out like consistent patterns for like interacting with these organizations. But like I think other DAOs are going to start to do this too, like figure out how to like interact or like swap tokens between each other, or like kind of going back to the like equity swapping like founder discussions. Like how do you create like DAO collectives and like allow DAOs to like interact with each other more fluidly? I think that's like naturally going to be like question that emerges. I think there's already a lot of DAOs talking about that. And if you see more DAOs doing that, then now you have like the group of like, you're just creating a larger and larger collective. Like I actually really want to write something on like the kind of like DAOs is like as firms, because like there's like the history of like firms and companies, and like I think DAOs kind of expand on that. Like you're not really dealing with companies anymore. You're not really dealing with like fixed entities, and like the more the DAOs do swaps, the more that definition expands over time. So I think as that happens, you'll probably also like there's even more reason for that like base layer to be funded, because it naturally intersects with the stuff they're doing anyway. So kind of a roundabout, like there's a few points in there that like kind of intersect themselves, but hopefully that's helpful.
No, definitely. Funnily enough, I have an extremely rough draft of that DAOs as firms as a being written. Well, it's on delay. I haven't looked at it in a while, but I can send that your way if you'd like to collab on that, because also something I'm very, very interested in. And I think as you begin to see a DAO as like an evolution of a firm rather than like a completely separate entity, a lot of these ideas that you're discussing become much more obvious, and the opportunity there becomes much more obvious as well. So really cool stuff. But I think there's one question in the questions feed that I think is related to this conversation, so I want to jump to that really quick. From Captain Skeletor: as more communities tokenize, how do we ensure that content created from the public goods doesn't get locked or paywalled or gatekept?
Yeah, I think on the content side, like we're definitely doing a bit of work on this. Like we have a community category, and like things like Bankless, which like kind of graduated now to become a DAO, and like things like Defiance, Weekend Ethereum, like all those sorts of like kind of like updates on the ecosystem were funded through Gitcoin grants. And I think increasingly you're seeing a lot more like variety of content being funded through Gitcoin grants. But I actually think for content specifically, like Mirror is also doing a really good job at this. Like Mirror is really, I think, creating an incentive for people to write publicly, to like share that knowledge publicly, and to do that with collaborators as well, like not just like in a vacuum. So to me, that's like I would look to them actually for like what's happening with content creation specifically. But from my perspective, like I think again, as long as you have the incentives, like as long as people are getting value for like creating this content. Like another example of this is Uniswap funded someone to write like these DeFi sort of tutorials. And I don't remember the exact details of that, but like the fact that those are being generated for Uniswap is actually like has led to other DAOs just saying, actually, yeah, we want this makes a lot of sense. And it's led to just a lot of different DAOs coming together and like funding this general DeFi, like kind of tutorial framework, which is like relevant to everyone, like all those protocols together. So I think going back to like the whole inter-DAO like collaboration thing, like in my mind, increasingly you're going to see DAOs like interact on these like small shared pieces of infrastructure, which include content, and then like they'll find ways to publish those together and like basically generate value from those together. Whether like in the case of tutorials, it's like more obvious because like the content goes directly back to getting people to use the platform. But like it's also, I think, clear in the context of like things that are like even just like general like more philosophical writing on a given subject. Like there's just a lot of value in like people exploring the space together, and like I think that's why you see a lot of people like really like there's a lot of like openness and the community tends to be very welcoming. I think part of that is related to the fact that like kind of like bringing new people in and like Web3 is still very new and like there's incentive to bring people in, and like if people start to actually understand the vision and you like have memed this thing into existence, if you've brought like this concept like to reality, like there's no reason that like the early internet even had to like succeed. Like people could be just, and like lots of people at the time were like, oh yeah, like this is a dumb idea, like the internet, like I don't know, like I'm just gonna like use my newspaper, keep reading my newspaper. Increasingly, like I guess content is a microcosm of this general like that of like the general like incentives that we like are able to create here, I guess. But yeah, I see a lot of good experiments happening around content. So those are just some examples of newer Gitcoin grants like community runs, and then those like inter-DAO sort of relationships.
Yeah, I want to double down on that third one. So you mentioned that increasingly we're going to see these inter-DAO relationships. Like, what are the big roadblocks in your eyes that are sort of like slowing that process down, maybe stopping that from happening? And how can we ensure that like DAOs can more cleanly interact for the funding of these sorts of public goods in the future?
That's a good question. Like we're hoping that we can be one of those coordination mechanisms. Like the goal of Gitcoin as a DAO is partly to be like a DAO of DAOs, I guess. Like I mean that's like a very nebulous like concept, but like the point of that like is just to say that like for like as an example, like if you know Uniswap can run this like side round for itself and like give back to a general public pool, and that public pool is allocated based on like the stewards and like their delegates and like an actual like democratic process, then like now you have like a public like now you like in my mind now you have a real public, right? Like in the sense that like you have a group of people who can like work together to like define the space that they're in and like work to improve it. Even if that's happening through like these like side interactions with DAOs that like aren't as interested in the public good. But then secondarily, I think, as I mentioned, like a lot of these DAOs realize that unlike being a SaaS company or something, like you will get dividends if you actually like participate and like give back to the community. Even projects that don't have like a real like ethos around it. Like I would actually put Uniswap in the category where like, especially like Uniswap grants and like those folks, like I know they really care about like public goods and like they have an ethos around it. But even when there isn't an ethos, like projects will give back to this pool because it like is kind of a social norm. Like Vitalik has a really good post around legitimacy or like on legitimacy that like touches on this. Like the social norms around like how you're giving back to public goods are very different in Web3 versus in like other places. And so I think that will just propagate these sorts of like these relationships like forming more frequently. I think, to be honest, the biggest barrier to like DAO coordination is mostly just that like almost all DAOs are like that are like active right now are like pretty new, relatively speaking. Like, and I think are still figuring out their own process. I know that's true for us. Like we're still figuring out, like we've only existed for like as a DAO 3 weeks versus like the 3 years of like organization like that we have as a organization for the company. And that's obviously like a learning curve. So I think, you know, you're increasingly going to see, unless like people get used to this model, like those relationships and like that, therefore like those collaborations like improving. But yeah, I don't like, it's hard to say what the timeline is, but I think like I think it will happen. There's just like enough incentives like for it to like it makes sense. Like I'd be surprised if it didn't.
No, definitely agree there. It definitely seems that, like you said, we're really early on in just individual DAO governance, and as those problems begin to get worked out, it's inevitable that we begin to see this inter-DAO governance become like more and more prevalent. And I don't know, that's exciting stuff. Like the benefits of that are obviously huge. So I'm excited to see what comes of that. SSP has a question. Infrastructure requires so many entities to be on the same page. Even just thinking a small local jurisdiction, the ball moves extremely slowly. What is the elevator pitch that turns on light bulbs above everyone's heads? And I guess I can add to that in just saying, like, what is the motivation for different DAOs or different individuals to encourage others to invest in the public goods? And I know we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but if we want to just like get a little bit more concise on that question.
Yeah, the elevator pitch would probably be something like, as a DAO, you rely on this infrastructure, you rely on like core infrastructure to run, and there are real like risks on the one hand for you not funding it, in that like the DAO could basically collapse in theory, you know, since it's not audited properly. But then the legitimacy posed by Vitalik probably provides the most concise like argument around social norms, which is like, are you really like a legitimate or like real DAO if you're not part of like, if you're not participating in the community, and if like part of participating in the community becomes funding public goods, which it seems to like kind of be right now, then that's like just a prerequisite for like really being a DAO. Like it almost is embedded into like the definition in some sense. The like coordination problem is a bit like longer to get into, I think. Like, which is just like, yes, it's very hard to like that's more like a DAO ops question. Like coordinating people in DAOs is like generally very difficult, and like to the extent that that's difficult, doing that for the purpose of funding public goods will be also difficult. But like, I don't think it's like, I think it's like very much like you can treat it as like the same. It's like very much like this, like it's like isomorphic to like any other problem, like DAO space. So like to the extent that DAOs can operate, then they can fund public goods. But like, can DAOs operate? Like so far, like there's progress for sure. But like that whole like kind of process of just like improving DAO ops, improving how we think about managing DAOs is like just the general open question.
Yeah, for sure. I think, like we said, that was a thread throughout this conversation. That was a really nice, clean summary. So I appreciate that. I think what we're going to do now is open the floor to audience questions. I have a feeling there's quite a few questions out there, and ways that we can push this conversation in different directions. So if anybody wants to raise their hands and come to the stage, please feel free. I'll give it like a 20, 30 seconds. And if not, I have a couple of questions that we could dig into as well. And Scott, also, this is like pretty open-ended. If there's like a particular topic that you want to dig more into and get like audience engagement on, more than happy to go that way as well.
I'd be really curious to just get a sense of like what other people like are finding like challenging, or like in terms of like DAO ops, like what do we think like is going to happen in terms of like how DAOs interact together? Like that's like the main I'm really curious about. And then like in terms of I guess like I'm still very interested in like the philosophical and like historic underpinnings of like what is a public and like what counts as public. So like any historical references or writing on that, like and actually I'm very down to take you up on like the post you're writing on like the like history of the firm, because like I was like Ronald Coast is like one person that comes to mind on that like topic. And then like there's a lot of other like older philosophers that like cover the topic of the public and such as well. But yeah, those are two, like, I mean, which are kind of common themes and like what I kind of been circling around here, but like those are the two things that I'm interested in.
For sure. Yeah, would love to get everybody's thoughts on that. Regarding the history of the firm piece, I think the two angles that hit it from are the angle we've been talking about right now. So just like the DAO as the evolution of the firm. And then the second angle would be like the individual as the evolution of the firm, and how does like the individual become empowered to take on like a lot of the roles and responsibilities of the firm in the context of like this broader ecosystem. And I think while DAO to DAO like interactions are an interesting enough question, I think DAO the individual interactions are even more interesting. Seeing a DAO not just as a place where individuals go to contribute, but also like an individual entity that could then interact with both other DAOs and other individuals. But yeah, if anybody wants to shoot some thoughts, awesome.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, Scott. Thank you for the talk. Just, it's more of the question. I'm wondering, like, where do you have a boundary between DAO, who decide public goods, and Gitcoin as a corporate? The reason I ask is I understand like you guys have been supported by Consensus and they got some venture funding. So as some extent, it's kind of profit-seeking entity. Then you grow the DAO. I just wonder, are you planning to kind of completely become the DAO is going to manage you guys, or are you guys kind of be a different entity? Like probably extreme example would be like in future is DAO deciding what's your salary, or like how much like Gitcoin as a corporate will receive that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think eventually it will. Like I think eventually the DAO would be like, and I kind of see that as true for like a lot of, like, again, that kind of goes back to the DAOs for the narrative, right? Like the idea is that like, yeah, whatever like Gitcoin Holdings as a company is, will just be one of many spokes that like, if the community decides is like acting in service of like the DAO's mission around public goods. So like how long that takes to play out is like question mark, because like there's just a lot to like unwind there. It's like probably a very similar conversation that like, it's like similar to like MakerDAO or like similar to like Uniswap. Like obviously MakerDAO is like now gone through the full like kind of like unwinding of the foundation like as just the DAO, which I think is like really ultimately like that would be where we want to end up. To be sure, like we can only make the decision to like dissolve or like remove the company. Like, we can't make any decisions around like the like DAO funding us. So like, I mean, we would have to probably make a proposal to like the DAO, which would be like, hey, we're like removing like dissolving the company, like still be doing that. Should we still be like acting together like as a group here? And then secondly, to the point about like what is in scope to the DAO, like technically there's no formal rule set or puts boundaries on it. I think a few stewards are working on those boundaries. And I think in my mind, the like natural boundary for now is probably going to be like Gitcoin grants, because Gitcoin grants is like the thing that one needs the most like community input, and two is just like the easiest for people to like interact with. Like interacting with like running at like hackathon, interacting with like managing the bounties platform like gets trickier. And we also have a lot of work to do in terms of like untangling like the mono repo and like a lot of like paying down a lot of tech debt so that people can more easily like plug in and like do work directly on the code base, even though it's open source, like just should be cleaner for people to work on. So like those are all things that are like in progress, but I think we will ultimately end up in a place where, yeah, like there's likely no company and where there's just the DAO.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Annie, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for giving me this chance. Hi, Scott. I hope you're doing good. And so my question is, it's a little bit biased towards kind of like the creators and communities around creators. So I'm currently experimenting about building DAOs with creators and their fans, and incentivizing within the communities, like kind of easy when I form DAOs among the communities, because it's easy to do it on chain. But I would just like to know what is your thoughts on like incentivizing other fans who are like off chain, who are interacting outside. For example, this is one of the challenging questions that I keep thinking about, is like when a fan enters the community, which is decentralized, from a non-decentralized place, like for example, like a Twitter follower who's just entering the community. They've already done the work of like, follow, share, and do all that stuff for the creator, because of which the creator has gained a lot of upside. And now the creator wants to incentivize them. Is there any mechanics that is coming up, or like, what are your thoughts? Just want to know about off-chain incentives.
So like in terms of off-chain incentives, like give me an example of like a creator, like what a creator might want to incentivize, and like, you know, how they would like do that off-chain.
Sure. Okay. When I'm talking this to telling about this to one of our creators now, cohort. So basically, they were, he was just like telling that, okay, so I have this one fan who's been like a really, really great hardcore fan. And he's been sharing my content, he's been like buying my merch, and he's also been like getting all my, like purchasing my courses on Gumroad and other places. And, but still like, is there any, so that is a very analog way in which we track all this, and then we kind of give a score for the fan so that the data can ultimately add drop some tokens when it enters the community. Is that an approach? But I don't know if there is going to be like a better approach that is going to come in, or like, is there a way to connect all these together in the blockchain?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's like definitely, and like, I think a lot of the folks here, like probably like, I mean, creator DAOs are really interesting to me from like I'm involved in like Seed Club and a bunch of other like DAO, which is like kind of more of a curator DAO. And like the way those operate is by like, yeah, it's hoping that kind of like share, like creates like this shared like membership, and that like allows people to, you know, incentivize basically like potentially like incentivize like voting on people joining, you know, cohorts, or to like in the case of DAO, like decide on like incentivize people to like purchase certain pieces of art. In the case of I would actually look at like REC's like ability test of this, like as an example of a creator DAO that like had a really interesting distribution. Like what he did was distributed a certain amount of tokens to people that like donated to his Patreon, that donated to other like basically Web2 places. Like, and in addition, he like gave some tokens to people that like purchased like the Tate funds or and so forth. And I think once you do that, yeah, you create like a group of fans that then like have the token, and through that process, like those fans can start to like, you know, hopefully guide the creator in certain directions depending on like what the creator wants them to vote on and what's in scope. That's always a question, right? It's like what kind of things are in scope like for a given DAO, which like can either be set by the creator or can either be like just or like the creator of the DAO or like people who are like members, like just like organic the DAO spawn. But like I think I would look at that model as the best example of someone kind of like taking people from Web2 and like fans from Web2 and like giving them that sort of like input. And yeah, you can of course once that's generated, like do all kinds of like bounties or like other rewards for people through that process. It's like that's like I think very important just to like make sure that like if people are doing something that's of value, like whether you're rewarding them via like Coordinate or like via like other tools for that, if there's a lot of dashboards that do this for coordination, it's extremely valuable to making sure people who are participating are being rewarded versus just like people who are on the sideline.
Thank you.
Awesome. Do we have anybody else? If not, okay, cool. Scott, I'm gonna put you on the spot for one more question. I think one common thread throughout all these answers has been this idea of like inter-DAO relations. If you had to put money on it right now, what is going to be like not even the killer app, but the killer feature, the killer interaction between DAOs that causes like a huge wave in DAO interactions that we see?
That's really, yeah, that's challenging. Like there's a lot of, the problem is it's like no one's really defined the ways that like those interactions work yet. Like the only way that people really define it is through swaps. Like that's pretty much all that's being done so far. And I think swaps are really interesting, obviously. But like I wouldn't call those like, I think I have the impression that there like has to be like more than just like swaps that like will be relevant. Like maybe an example would be like some of the stuff like Urine does, where you start to get like these almost like merge type behaviors, or where, you know, one other example might be where like rather than just a swap to treasuries, there's actually like almost some kind of direct reward and multiple tokens to people that contribute to a given idea or project. So you like kind of like value that's shared across like multiple protocols, kind of like what happened with the DeFi tools. But like beyond those things, I'm like not quite thinking enough to know like, what else will be out there. Like I think I'm sure there's a lot of like more automated kind of like interactions you could create where, yeah, like maybe there is a sort of like maybe one of the interactions that would be interesting, and this could happen as a result of the token swaps in the Bitcoin DAO, would be if those swaps you actually had DAOs themselves voting on like what are public goods through their token holdings in GTC, and through that process they like generated some kind of like new pool together, or like some kind of maybe even like shared like extension of the existing platform together. Like that kind of like inter-DAO voting that comes from the swaps seems really interesting. But like, it's very hard to say beyond that, like almost because like most DAOs that exist right now are still so early. And like, I think a lot of the DAOs that exist right now are still like kind of in their own bubbles to some extent. So like, you know, here's maybe an example would be like, what if like Pleasure DAO and like Party DAO or whoever like partner together on like a shared distribution of like fractional NFT or something like that. That seems like a slight extension from like just the swap idea, which could feasibly happen. Like I could see that being something that takes place like in the next like 6 to 12 months. But yeah, even like I still feel like there's stuff even beyond like those are like I like those examples. They're very like tangible to me, but like there's probably other like longer term examples that I'm not, you know, far enough ahead to think about.
No, 100%. And I think, like you said, there's 2 steps of the process here. Step 1 is as more and more DAOs become like more mature in their own individual governance, you'll see some creative ideas and also needs pop up. And step 2 will be like how can you fulfill those needs by interacting with other DAOs rather than keeping things internal, right? And in what way does coordination become easier by interacting with another established DAO versus just like bringing on new contributors into your own? I think those are like open questions that like as they become answered will lead to a lot of these examples that we're trying to come up with. But right now it's pretty difficult to answer. If nobody else has any questions, I will give the floor really quick, Scott, if you want to plug Gitcoin, anything else that's going on, ways people can get involved, et cetera, et cetera.
Definitely. The Gitcoin grants round is the best and like most obvious way right now in terms of how to get involved in Gitcoin.co/grants is like active right now. The interface still needs a bit of work, but like you should be able to sort of go and like select grants to contribute to. If you have a grant that you want to put up that you haven't, please put that up. Anyone can do that. There's no barrier to putting anything up. And then I would also just say like, yeah, if you are interested in getting involved in governance, like gov.gitcoin.co is a very active sort of like forum for that discussion. There's a thread in there that like is pretty open. Like if you want to become a steward, you can just like post in that thread. That's all it takes right now to become a steward. Like the stewards might eventually add more process to that. But that's effectively like the best way to really become an active part of governance conversations. So far, those conversations have been around like ratifying grants rounds, figuring out like treasury management decisions like, with the whole Akita situation, and increasingly around like how we prototype new concepts for public goods funding. Austin Griffith and others are really working actively on that through this like Moonshot Collective idea. I would say those are probably the best ways, but yeah, feel free to reach out if you have more questions. Not Scott Moore at Twitter, and happy to dive in more.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. This was a really fun conversation. Appreciate everybody coming out. If you did not get your Pope, please check out the voice text channel. And hopefully we will be having another one of these next week, possibly on Twitter Spaces. So stay tuned. But yeah, Scott, really, really appreciate it, and hopefully talk soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much, all.